Welcome. Thank you very much for those joining us in person and online. Today we're looking at going live, how ESM can reduce the risk in paperwork. And I'd like you to imagine that you're a project manager. You're on the cusp of a delivery. You're about a day away. Your team spent the last 12 weeks working really hard, burning the midnight oil, and your senior sponsor has put their reputation on the line for this to go live. But then you get a call just before you go no-go from the PMO. He says, I'm sorry, you're going to get a no-go decision because you haven't completed all your operational acceptance criteria. The head of infrastructure and operations hasn't been informed, and they're going to block it. How did this happen? How did we get so far and put the business at risk? But then consider from the other side, you are that head of infrastructure and operations. You've been told about this project. It's been coming up for months and you've not been engaged. You've just figured out that it's going to cost you another 3 FTE that you need to put in your team. And they've not been even recruited. And you're going to be another 3 months to get that. And you're not sure that the changes you put in recently have been incorporated in their design, which might mean there's code conflicts. So you can see there's a real tension here between the two. Now, how do we resolve it? How do we make sure that we're addressing the risk in the right way? Because to be fair to that project manager, they might have sat down with the PMO and they might have gone through those operational checklists in great detail and got to every one of them. But the problem in this example was that it was a deputy who signed off that operational acceptance criteria, and the deputy had forgotten to provide the other checklist, which referred out to the infrastructure and operations lead. So it was an administrative error that caused chaos. You see, what happened here is typical of many organizations. We put in place extra controls to adjust risk and to stop things from occurring. But what we don't realize is those controls create an absolute fragmented web of administrative mess that everyone's got to navigate. And they actually increase the risk of missing something. And more importantly, they reduced our ability to think. So today, what I want to do is propose a much more streamlined version of release and service operation acceptance criteria that can really help guide your projects, guide your work packages through to live, right-size it, work smarter, and fundamentally understand why we're doing what we're doing. So that's what we're here for today, to give you the tools to go back to your organization and challenge all this stuff and make sure it is actually right-sized and appropriate. And we're not just doing admin for admin's sake or because someone 5 years ago had a risk that they want to try and mitigate. So, I'm Mark Harrison, Associate Director within our ServiceNow practice, ServiceNow Master Architect. Also, my main interest is in service management. So it's in the theory behind the work we do every day. So why does the work we do, incidents, problems, changes, and all this stuff, why does it work? Why does IT service management, enterprise service management deliver the benefits and seem to describe the world we live in? I'll pass over to my colleague, Rachel, to introduce.
Kia ora all online and watching the recording. My name is Rachel. I'm a consultant here at Deloitte in our technology, strategy and transformation team. And recently I've had the pleasure of working with Mark on kind of enterprise service management and a specific engagement where we looked at service blueprinting and ESM as a framework, and since then I have sat and been certified in my ITIL 4 service management training. So before we kick off, just thought we'd run through the agenda so you know what you're in for. This is kind of a welcome. Nice to meet you all on the call. Mark's going to run through our ESM overview, looking at the model itself and how kind of putting together good practice will help your organization in the long run. Then we're going to look at a couple challenges that are commonly faced by organizations in release and deployment. And then we'll look to kind of the actual process of going through release and managing release and landing the change. Obviously quite daunting for organizations, so addressing some of those concerns and how can we mitigate them with our release templates and approaches. And then we'll have some time at the end for a bit of Q&A. So if anyone doesn't have any pressing questions, I'll hand back over to Mark to kick us off.
Thank you. Excellent. So enterprise service management. It's a framework that's been around for about 5 years now. Came out of Inland Revenue very much from a deep desire to understand the why behind the work we do every day. Now, I'm not someone who takes, someone saying, oh, it's good practice. My question is always, well, why? Someone might then try and back it up with a statistic like, oh, 80% of organizations who do this good practice find that it works. And again, response, why? Those 80% of organizations might be Fortune 100 companies based in the US in mining industry, which is completely different to healthcare. So you can't necessarily take statistics as a proxy for understanding. You've got to actually have a theory behind why you do what you do. For instance, in the physics world, you've got they're smashing atoms together and trying to predict where masses of particles are. And they might see that one of the particles is off the charts and completely unexpected result. Great, evidence proves it. They get the same result every time. But fundamentally, what is that scientist going to ask? Why? Right? They need a theory in order to justify the reality, in order to understand it. And to do that, we generally use things like models. So for ITIL 4 and ITIL v3 and all the other frameworks that we know around IT service management, I started here because this is one of the most sort of familiar areas of service management, where you've got the practices like incident, issue, problem, change, request. What ITIL does is it gives you 34 of these management practices, and it just gives you them in 3 lists. There's specialist, general, and technical practices. But it's all quite arbitrary. And you think when you put something in a list like that, you've no idea if there's gaps, you've no idea if there's overlaps, you've no idea what's conflicting between the two, right? You can only do your best. What's better to do is put it into a model like this, which actually gives us some information beyond the actual contents of the model itself. So here in the earlier presentations, previous years, we did I used the example of a Roman store. Today we could use whatever example we wanted, maybe a bakery. So you've gone down to a bakery to get some cakes or something like that. So think of how many ways you could interact with that bakery from a service management perspective. You could transact, you could get a loaf of bread from them, you could suggest, if you then pick that bread up and find out it's moldy on the bottom, that's an issue. You're going to report that. You might have a request for a specific menu item they can make out the back. You might have want them to help cater for you or something like that. So different ways we can interact. Each of these then requires some action on the part of the organization. So it's delivery. So someone's going to make that bread available for you to purchase. If the bread is moldy, you're going to take it, they're going to look at it, triage it, figure out, maybe I need to replace this. Okay, there you go. It's going to be tasks to fulfill requests, initiatives to serve ideas, and so on. And what service management decided was that this is great, but it's quite inconsistent because everyone's got different interpretations. So what we're going to do is we're going to put some guardrails in place. We're going to have continuity. So if the availability breaks down, we can restore it. We're going to have problems to address root causes of incidents. So why is bread moldy every week? Is it because someone's turning the fridge down? What about the change control? So if you've got a chef there or a baker who's new, first day on the job, you're probably going to check their output before you give it to the customer. And then release to ensure initiatives. And we'll touch on that one very much as part of this presentation. Underneath all this is the knowledge, the foundation that we need to build on. We need an understanding of our service, how our assets are configured, all of the information around design, risk, cost, communication, those sort of things. So essentially what we're describing is ways of working. So don't think too much of this as like practices, as organizational teams and that kind of stuff. This is just very much work that we all do every day. Every type of work we're doing pretty much falls into one of these buckets. And fundamentally, what we're trying to do as part of this is serve. Now, everything within ESM is a service. Everything we do, absolutely, from macro down to micro. Right? Everything, including the use of a pen, is service. Right? The pen is serving me when I write with it. Thinking back into an organization, you've got, as an organization, if you're a business owner and you want to set up a bakery, for example, you as might be wealthy owner, right? You might appoint someone else, like a manager, to go and do it for you, or you might do it yourself. You basically want to direct someone to go out to a consumer and generate some demand for the service. From that, you go out and get some providers, people. Again, it might be yourself if it's only small, or you could appoint someone else, hire someone, another company. You're going to create a service and commission it for use. Then as the consumer uses the service, there's going to be a contract of how things should be, as in you expect your bread not to be mouldy. And if you have an issue, then you're entitled to get support. And there is, again, a set of expectations there of how support should be run. You want that bread to be swapped out pretty quickly. And if it isn't, you've probably got to management. And again, will you use that bakery again? It's a relationship contract there. So thinking through all these different components here coming together, we've actually seen these use, support, manage, and govern on the previous slide. Right, so all of those practices underneath actually fall within these buckets. So this brings them together into a service and shows how they all interact. We can then build up one step further, and this is where ESM gets to its four-dimensional model. So we're trying to model a service, bakery, and we know that bakery is using each of the four aspects of work, as we've just shown. We know there are four actors, per what we've just seen before. Two of them very familiar from ITIL, consumer and provider of a service, come together to co-create value. The integrator comes from service integration and management, which is when you're scaling up multiple providers. You need someone to act as that bridge to the consumer. And then the organization is added by ESM, because essentially the organization is why the service is there. They're commissioning it, they're governing it, controlling it. We are modeling the organization after all. And then we can add in the remaining, you've heard the old adage, people, process, and technology. We have purpose, process, data, and tools in this. And those are their assets. Generally, everything fits within those camps that the actors can use in accordance with the aspects of work. And we bundle all of this stuff up into entities or structure within our organization. So we have services, we can also have functions, and we can bundle services up into portfolios and that sort of thing to commission them. So that is a complete model of the organization in a way. But we also have the more intangible things like goals, principle, mission, and resource that we need to consider as well. Essentially, what we're trying to do here is describe a service. And if you're thinking about release management, what you're thinking is that we need to, what is the purpose of a release at the end of the day? Okay. We've got a starting point. We know where we are today. The release is all about taking us to the next step, where we want to be. And we do that by using the model. So where we want to be is in line with our mission, sets our end state position, and goals and principles help keep us on track on the way. Resource tells us how far we can get, because we need to put people, we need to pay people, we need to throw money at things to actually move it forwards. But our path is never going to be straight. Right? There's forces and things that impact us on our way. So as we go through, what we need to do is understand our sphere of control, things that we can actually impact on a day-to-day basis through our decisions, right? So we can direct our own employees. But we can't do that with our partners and suppliers. We need to provide them instruction, and then they will direct their staff. So over time, what we want to try and do is navigate our organization to move our spheres of control and influence within our sphere of potential, right, to get to our target state. So we can move our organization around, we can go and have conversations with people, we can try and increase our sphere of influence, right, because that's where we can actually do something with to mitigate these forces. But there is the final sphere, which is visibility, that we need to consider, and that's really important for our release management today, because this is where the boundary of risk is. Essentially, everything on the other side of the sphere you know nothing about, so hence it's a risk. It could be an opportunity as well, which is just negative risk. But we want to make sure that we are considering those things that we don't know about as well. And that is the purpose of what we're going to look at today. So we're going to look at the risks that we face when delivering projects and services, and then what we can do about them.
Thanks. I'm going to nicely, after Mark nicely segued us into risk, I'm going to pose a bit of a Uno reverse to the crowd here and ask, before I kind of reveal the obstacles that we've identified, what do you online or in person commonly see key challenges or obstacles that you've experienced when delivering your projects and services? Shout out, we're just a small crowd.
Stakeholder misalignment.
Perfect.
But lack of clear benefits to align the delivery teams.
You probably have to speak shout into the microphone.
Regular scope creep.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. That's good.
Still.
There you go.
Perfect. Someone called out misalignment. See on our list, new project or service doesn't align with the constraints of the wider organisation. We've identified, I guess, across multiple different large organisations who have experienced the lack of alignment between not only wider business units or maybe specific teams or project teams. They're all kind of operating in silo and with various templates, various ways of working, and just not as a very integrated organisation. This lack of integration can be super messy, not only for the organisation, but other stakeholders and other people within. Due to this, it becomes quite isolated processes come in, and then it's kind of limited to the documentation and processes aren't captured wholly. And this unstandardized kind of way of capturing information and production of multiple templates is super clunky and kind of impacts the release itself. So when working with providers and kind of out-of-the-box tools and workflows, this lack of alignment and structure can really impact the ability to integrate and release technology consistently across your organization. And then you and the stakeholders are kind of confused at what needs to be captured in the service documentation, and it kind of just translate into a poor transition. So in order to mitigate this risk, I think it's in the transition itself. So it's really important to take a kind of standardized, pragmatic approach. We want to deliver the minimum viable product at a reasonable kind of sense and document kind of the least but the most to reach the ultimate benefits. That leads us kind of into the benefits of release management. So as Mark referred to before, the reality of implementing change can be really daunting, not only for an organisation, but the stakeholders as well. And because of this, it's really important to implement good release management into your organisation to ensure that the services are structurally aligned and not only with your organisational policies, but also with the service provider stakeholder agreement that would have been formed. So this can be in the format of testing, stakeholder sign-offs, training documents, and other kind of artifacts that help mitigate or the general or specifically identified risks like we saw in the slide previously. So as we discussed, the risks and challenges associated with delivering projects and services, imagine addressing kind of minimizing the likelihood of aligning various ways of working and producing release templates that consume all the different inputs. So utilizing release management processes, we ensure that release information is documented uniformly and provides a reliable and consistent standardization across the organization. Continuous improvement also plays a vital role in processing and embedding service management best practices and fosters a kind of culture of innovation through establishing an overarching framework for ongoing tracking of ideas and initiatives. It really helps organizations adapt, evolve, and ensure their approaches remain relevant and effective. And maintaining standardized templates for go live and deployment is really essential for keeping the service information accurate and current. So for these templates, they serve as a bit of a foundation for not only consistent documentation, but again, a bit of a reference point for the organisation to come back to, or the project team, to maintain the service and provide kind of capturing future updates alongside the original go live kind of templates. It kind of acts as like a living repository, enhancing the knowledge sharing and ensures that all stakeholders have access to the most up-to-date organisation, promoting the transparency and informed decision making. Now go into what a release is against the different frameworks. Hand off, Mark.
Thank you. So it kind of said that we've got all these risks. We said that release management is a good way to address them, and Rachel gave a load of benefits for doing so. But let's ask the question, why? What is a release, firstly? So we're asking, who's in release management? What's a release? And this is a fairly controversial question, actually, among service management experts, because you're getting different definitions even within ITIL itself. You know, the dial has been moved a fair bit from V3 to V4. So V3, if you get a chance to read on screen there, there's it's plan, build, deploy, early life support, and closure. Very much a waterfall method through what you consider to be a release of an initiative. Now, ITIL 4 has taken a different approach, and they've said, well, companies like Facebook and other software providers, they're releasing features all the time. You know, then they're really separating this deployment from the actual turning on of the features. So Facebook will do a deployment, but no one will notice. They'll then turn on the feature later. So it's about feature flagging and cutover, bringing in for the continual improvement, continual development. Now, this is all well and good, but it does kind of leave us with a bit of a gap. So let's have a look at our model again. Where does release sit on this? So notices it
Down in the middle?
down the middle, yeah. It sits below initiative. So saying that the purpose of this is to ensure that an initiative delivers value. Now, how can we ensure that an initiative delivers value if we're just managing when a feature is turned on and off? For instance, it feels like we need a bit more than that. The definition of release needs to be a bit more chunky. So ESM's gone and said, well, you know, how about we want to really focus on that value, right? Because that's what is an initiative at the end of the day. What do you want when you're doing a project? Because that's what a release is about, right? It's about facilitating project progression to life. What do we want out of that ultimately?
To deliver value for your project.
Value, absolutely. So we want outputs, we want to turn those to outcomes, and then we want ultimately value from those outcomes. So if I consider a pen here, for instance, so that pen is produced as part of a project, and that it's going to get delivered to that pen. But say you want to actually use this pen for delivering a document, right? What do you have to do? You know, I put the pen down on the table for you. What do you have to do to it?
Yeah.
You have to pick it up.
Get
You
a
have
piece
to
of paper.
get a piece of paper and write with it, right? You have to use the pen as it's intended in order to deliver the value. So while the change is all about managing the risk with the delivery of the pen to the requirements, and the fact it's going to go live and it's not going to disrupt anything else that's going on, the release is about making sure that this pen is actually delivering value. Now, who delivers the value? Who makes this pen deliver value? If you had to look around the model for ESM, it's a bit of a trick question, but if the pen's on the table and you want to get a document out,
You.
yeah, it's up to the people, right? It's the people, it's the stakeholders. So hence, release is all about stakeholders. And if they want value, then we've kind of got to say, well, it's all about the stakeholders realizing value. So what we really want to say is that, you know, we've got an intended value of this pen to deliver all those documents. We want to make sure that we realize all of that value. And of course, there's risks to that. You know, what could go wrong with that pen to document experience?
Run out of ink.
Run out of ink. What if it's legal and you must use black ink? And I've given you a blue pen. Yeah, what if the lid comes off like that? Not going to last very long. Right? Could break, could not be the right quality. All these things, right? Trivial example. But essentially, we've got to accept some of that risk. So we've got to make sure that our controls that we're putting in place are right size for that. But ultimately, it's going to be about what the stakeholders are expecting, because they're the ones that are going to deliver the value. So we need to ask them. That's kind of the point. All right. So it's not about actions that we're taking. It's about risk. We need to address risk. So Rachel mentioned it's all about checklists. Yes, eventually it's about checklists, but firstly, it's about risk. Come back to that in a minute. Secondly, it's not about projects, it's about service. So what was that diagram before? All these aspects come together to deliver a sustainable service. Yeah, it's not a project. The initiative's just a bit in the middle. So really, when you're writing documents, and a lot of these release processes are trying to get you to write a project document. You want a project design, they want a project acceptance criteria, they want a project test plan, they want project infrastructure, handover doc, and this, that, and the other. You end up with 100 artifacts for each project, whatever it is, and then 100 projects over the years. You're a service owner. How do you know where change to thing happened in all that lot? How do you know what your current state is? Because it's been gradually built up over the last 5-10 years. Answer is you don't, because it's buried away in documents. So hence, would it be better if we actually had a single document that outlined the current state, which is what we've been saying about at the beginning, the model, enterprise service management, is about documenting your current state and maintaining that. So it's about current state and change. So focus in on doing a design for the service and then changing that design. So the project should be feeding change into that service repository. Now, there's things you want the project to do, but won't necessarily care about, like test run 3, and there was a failure in test case 5. Sure, that's great. You want to know the project did that because you want to know the due diligence, but you don't necessarily care about it in 5 years' time. So just index it, store it in the project repository. So it's about maintaining the distinction between the two really clearly and feeding in ultimately, always feeding the service. So if we can do that, then we kind of realize that actually what this is about risk management. All these checklist items, all the things that we're doing, is actually about building up knowledge of these things. So knowledge of what we've done to address the risk. Because we've got to, whilst we may put in a wonderful new system to fend off DDoS password attacks, something like that, that's great, it's in the system, but we kind of need to know about it. Therefore, you're always going to have to document it. You're always going to have to model this service somewhere, right? And that is knowledge, essentially. So your project, your initiative, your release is essentially having to update the service's knowledge all the time. Right, so you're updating the service. You also need to update our knowledge of that service, the logical model of it. And what we're saying is that you need to do this. That's quite nebulous, right? It's a bit fluffy. Okay, update the knowledge. Yeah. So what we've done is said that we can focus our attention into 3 documents that we'll come on to in a little bit. So we can look at the service contract, which covers the management and governance of the service. We can provide a service design, which covers the operational use. And we can also provide a support charter, which is how the service will be supported. So if you can do those 3 documents, you cover all 4 aspects of work at a high level. We can then dive into the content of each of those and make sure we iterate through. And it's kind of a repository, almost. It points you out to all the relevant artifacts that you need to bring in. So it's just a common taxonomy for actually documenting a service in a holistic way. And by doing that, we can then apply a release checklist. So we can go through a checklist that basically says update all these bits. And we can record what we've done. And now we've got full traceability across that as to what's been updated and when and why. And you have your ultimate goal, which is to build the knowledge of that service. So whenever you want to make a change here, you can go, that's our current state. Right. Yeah, that was considered. All good. Cool. So so that brings us back to pretty much what Rachel mentioned, right? Checklists of actions, but we're still not quite there. Because checklist implies control, right? And at the beginning of the example that I gave around, wanting to apply all these controls to prevent that risk of the team needing to hire more people, and because they hadn't been consulted, they end up getting hit with a potential solution that would cause cause chaos to their staff and overwork them. But it's not about that. It's really about thinking through the risks. Right? Is there actually a risk or not? So firstly, we want to, based on the overview of the release, we want to identify those risks and mitigations first. So that's the first step, right? It's all about risk. So identify the risks, identify the mitigations. And they're going to come from a series of common risks, common readiness activities. So like we mentioned before about stakeholders not being informed, you've not engaged security, you've got security sign off, that addresses several risks, always happen. Have you done privacy impact assessment? Have you done your testing correctly? These are common risks with every project. Right? It's why we have stage gates, it's why we have project management methodologies. All of that stuff is basically trying to do this, what we're trying to do here, which is release. So we're saying we want to ensure the initiative. Yeah, so we ensure the initiative by addressing the common risks. The trick then is to tailor those common risks and not just go, I'm going to do these 15 actions because every project does it, but actually test that and go, is that a risk for me? Is that a risk for my project now? No point doing stuff if your project's so small it's not really going to ever impact the FTE of that team, because you might add them an extra half hour's work or something. They're not going to hire another person for that. Why do it? That's how you challenge and right size. So the idea is that these checklists should be negotiated before each initiative, before each release. Right, so not only should each service be predefining its checklist based upon the nuance of that service. So if you've got regulatory concerns, you put in regulatory risks, therefore regulatory checklist items. You should then tailor it per initiative as well, depending on the scope and scale of the initiative. You might have several checklists that you drag off the shelf and then make minor adjustments, whatever it is. So that's your first step. Grab the checklist, tailor it, then you agree the owners and dates, and now you can see that you've got a plan to get through. Right? So the key thing here is that everything should relate to a risk. And once you do that, once you start projects thinking about this, then they're actually taking ownership of these risks because it's in their interest. Right? We've just said that it's all about outcomes and value. And what does the project want to deliver?
No.
Outcomes and value. That's it. So they're in interest now to do this, not just simply throw it over the fence to operations to say, oh, please help us with this. We don't really want to bother. It's blocking our go live. Right? It's now about the outcomes. We have them on the line. Cool. Rachel, plan.
So as Mark referred to before in the framework diagram, we worked with a client to create 4 kind of documents. 1, the service contract, service design, support charter, and release checklist. So as the framework referred to before, knowledge base sits across the top, and then the service contract, service design, and support charter were sitting underneath, included as documents within this knowledge base. And this provides a structured approach for specific guidelines and promotes good practice through the forming of the basis of the relationship between the service organisation and other actors, which we've mentioned kind of through the ESM framework earlier. It's intended to extend the scope of the service and kind of what stakeholders' expectations are, what's been agreed to be delivered, and then also how to support and maintain an application service post-release and ensuring that the information is captured in that living repository I mentioned earlier and can act as the go-to source of truth leading into the future. So, like Mark has already mentioned, all the documents are meant to be read in conjunction with one another and outline different aspects of the service itself. So the contract is more governance and management, design leads into that purpose, process, data, and tooling, and service is more about support going forward and performance management itself. So based on our experience with the client I mentioned earlier, we designed a bit of a timeline of engagement. So as you can see on the screen, we've got each little gates or stage gates that kind of lead you into the next phase of the engagement process. So starting with engage for templates, usually reach out to the transition manager for the templates themselves, ensuring that you're using the most up-to-date systematic templates, ensuring that the whole organisation are using the same templates themselves. Then leading into the service contract and confirming the checklist items. These are kind of interchangeable around which way you do, depending on whether it's a new service itself or whether it's an updated service. Leading into the kind of knowledge transfer and design of or population of each of the templates. We've got the service design, the support charter, and then again going back to finalize the service design. And these are kind of just populating them, ensuring alignment and cohesion between all the documents and referencing between the documents instead of kind of repeating yourself across all three. And then we'll complete the checklist just before go live, ensuring that you've got the kind of final readiness for each checklist item and project sign off and stakeholder acceptance from the relevant parties you need. Then we've got the big dance, the actual go live itself, and then we'll head into kind of handover to BAU, ensuring that any finalization of the documents, any checklist items have been crossed off, such as lessons learned or issue register, an update to the final docs to ensure that was what got released, and then BAU handover. We'll now deep dive kind of into each of these documents themselves. So the service contract specifies how the activities the organisation perform can be considered as providing services, and the co-creation of value between the service actors as the consumer, provider, integrator and organisation. And then the aim of governance is to direct the enterprise and services and achieve the vision of the optimal value, ensuring its credit. So it's...
So you think this, so you remember the service contract at the beginning, it's in the bottom corner there. But this is essentially our understanding of the expectations between the consumer and the provider. So it's not a legal contract, but it's just a document that outlines the governance and management to really provide those expectations. And so in here, you'll have things like the success metrics and the operating model for it, so how it's going to work. What are the high-level requirements in here? What controls do you need to put in place? It kind of goes in here. It sets your overarching sort of document, overarching framework for the service, basically, that then needs to be designed within. Yeah, so each of these documents will fit within the other. So the service contract's kind of the overarching. Right, in the top, you've usually got the external controlled factors, like the your brief, your charter, your mandate, your budget, those sort of things that are provided and imposed on you. You'll have those at the top as a reference, and then you'll go and devise then the next level of management and governance that you have control over as a service owner. So there's a lot coming back on the service owner here. They are ultimately accountable for these documents, and it's ultimately for their benefit, right? So if you're a service owner, you can go, yep, this is my governance, these are all my forums, this is who's responsible, this is who I'm delegating to, that sort of thing in there. So that's that's what this covers.
In going into the service design itself, this is kind of how the service is designed with respect to the 4 elements I mentioned before: purpose, process, data and tooling, and then also any decisions or assumptions that need to be made. And it specifies, I guess, the co-creation of value between those service actors, consumer, provider, integrator and organisation, and how the outcomes in the service contract will be delivered. So then there's that linking element as the service contract's the overarching document. So the service design that we wrote was obviously in relevance to ESM and ITIL frameworks. So then it touches on the 4 elements of serve, operate, sustain, and view. So it's looking at defining the service itself, how the design for the service and the architecture layers kind of maintain access, security, and then sustains more that maintaining availability, continuity, and that leans into then the support charter itself as well, and views more obtaining visibility of the outcomes that the service is wanting to achieve.
So this is where we're really bringing together all those elements of the service in one place, as Rachel says. So here we're working through ESM systematically. Now, you may already have templates for solution architectures, high-level designs, as-built documents, all that good stuff. That's fine. We're saying refer out to them. What would happen is if you've got a small project, you might just use this document and record in the relevant section with a diagram or something that might be sufficient. The aim is that this stuff is flexible and expandable as needed. So just put in here whatever your service owner desires you to put in, right? Because they're ultimately the ones who needs to be accountable for it and also justify to others if they need to provide that information. Better have it in the document because then it's easier to provide. So.
Next one, the support charter. So this document serves as the guide for supporting your specific service or project with the view of maintaining the service, like I mentioned just before, and delivering on those confirmed service actions and kind of request fulfillment from your stakeholders. So this document outlines the responsibilities and processes and procedures that will effectively support the service going forward and ensuring it's maintained out into the future. So no service can exist in isolation, which is why kind of all of these documents are integrated together and rely on each other to present that whole overarching framework that Mark spoke about before. So this support relies on, I guess, prepare, restore, action, and monitor, as you can see in the blue kind of box to the left. So prepare is all about maintaining the service through planning, and that relies on kind of self-help and training and life cycle and maintenance. Then you go into restore, which is the knowledge base, body of knowledge that address reporting, impacting, and causes of service degradation. Action leads into the request catalog, task prioritization, and change. So that's kind of delivering consumer entitlements and assisted requests, as well as managing how you manage change. And monitor as a final section, going into SLA targets, tracking any risks to the services, event monitoring and alerting, just tracking the status of events and risks.
That's cool. So this one will fall in line with your organizational either blueprint, or if you've got a framework where you've kind of defined your overarching incident process and that sort of thing. So you'll define those at a macro enterprise level. This document is mainly around who is involved. So if you have an organizational change process, for instance, this is defining who the technical approvers are, who's ultimately making escalation decisions, who the change manager is, and that sort of thing from a roles perspective right in here. So it's the nuance within the process that's specific for the service. If you had any redesign of the incident process for whatever good reason, you would also put it in here. But yeah, so in conjunction with the overarching, just as though the design would be in conjunction with your enterprise architecture, and of course your contract is in conjunction with the overarching governance of the organization. Yeah. Well, good. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Today, we've covered a good number of things, right? We've tried to show you release management from first principles, so how it's built up and how it comes about from enterprise service management. It's really about getting us from A to B. It's about delivering value through the outputs. So we're doing a piece of work. We want to make sure that that piece of work gives us exactly the benefits that we thought it would, right? And there's always risks that come in. And release is all about mitigating those risks. And essentially, if we can build up that catalog of those risks, we can then apply proper mitigations. And we're saying a lot of those mitigations come about and can be handled by creating these documentations, having good knowledge of what your service is all about, good knowledge of the contract, good knowledge of the design, good knowledge of how you're going to support. If you think about it, what your key risks are on your project when you begin, pretty much falls into one of those categories. So by thinking through all these things, designing for them, we can basically eliminate a lot of the risk on the project. And we know we need that stuff there, ready for future. We're constantly updating it. We're not doing rework each time, new design doc. We're just updating the same old design with a change log. So we can hopefully reduce the amount of effort required. So this is all subjective stuff. I mean, there's risks there that we'll identify and we can argue about, but ultimately value is in the eye of the beholder. So we need to make sure that we get to a point where stakeholders will accept this stuff. So what should go in a release checklist? we can't directly tell you, but your stakeholders can. Right? We can give you guidance on what should potentially be in there, but your stakeholders are ultimately the one who are going to accept it in order to use it, support it, give you what you need for it. Right? So they're the ones who've got to buy into it as well. So very much, we want to encourage you to take a risk-based approach for this, not just paperwork for paperwork's sake. And I hope that'll help you push back on some of the excess and just allow people the space to actually think about this stuff, because it's in everybody's interest that we get this right, and deliver those outcomes. So please do have a look at the ESM framework if you're interested. Reach out with any questions to Rachel or I. And there's a couple of additional presentations linked here where we go through the foundations of the framework, how it came about, and then application to config, which is very much a precursor to organizational modeling. Thank you very much. Take any questions?
Thanks all.
All good. Just give a second. Come off mute.
No, Hemant, we can't hear you.
Can you hear us?
think,
Someone, do you want to put it in chat if we can't hear you?
yeah, I think he has a question.
Sure.
Can you just put it in the chat, Hemant, please?
For joining us, if it was helpful.
Got a question.
Yeah, that's all right. How does it support release sequencing? Good question. And release dependency management. So this is where you've got multiple releases that are sitting underneath a project, right? Which is ultimately underneath the service. Yeah, so there's concepts. So we're very much in release at the moment, but ESM goes up a couple of levels above that. So it says, so we want to keep release very much focused on that acceptance fraction. How do we realize the benefits of that specific individual unit work package, right? Because that is a discipline in its own right. Then what we do is, to your point about sequencing, that goes up then into a release program. So we want to treat the two separately within ESM because they are very different disciplines. One's about scheduling and one's about conflict dependency management, and the other one's about the actual acceptance of this individual work package. Right, so what you do is you plot all of these releases on a diagram as part of the program, and then you map out the dependencies between the two. Right, so it's a level up. It's as if it's project versus program kind of thing. The program is ultimately accountable for the benefits within the program. So that's similar concept here, if that helps. So we haven't really touched on that too much today.
Yeah. Because one of the challenges is I come from a setup where we have been having multiple releases, like 25, 30 releases going on per day. And sometimes you find out that an infrastructure release has gone through ahead of your release. So it has gone out of sequence. So that causes a challenge in completing your release, and you have to roll back because you have no choice. So everything has gone well up to staging, but the production live release sometimes has to be rolled back. So that's why I asked, like, how do you manage, suggest to manage dependencies, and then the sequencing, is there any AI based or any additional feature that we can use to make that aware before we proceed with the release? At least, like, you have planned to start the release today, but today before you start, you get certain indications to check, like, did you intend testing or releasing with this package also in production, or like this infrastructure change in production, something like that? If there's any way to compare with the previous environment's state to the current production state, like staging, what was your what other releases were there before you deployed your release, and likewise, because you can never manage all the sequencing. I think no matter how you manage, right? So the systems has to facilitate. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, it does. It does. You're right. Once you get down into the weeds of code and config, then you're into your GitHub repository. That's why we've got that, isn't it? With codes, commits, pull branches, and all that kind of stuff. You get to manage that real low-level stuff. We're talking a bit more up at the higher level here, where, like, to your point, you would have a checklist item in there that says go check the dependencies, right? So you'll be managing those at the beginning. You'll be managing them as you go for deploy, and then you're also managing them through change as well with cab. So there's a few touch points there where you should be catching this stuff. Technical review, the fact that you're updating all those documents together. So if you're updating the same section as someone else, good chance you might conflict. So if you're both in flight and showing it on that services in-flight change register, so in one of the documents in the contract, I think we have in-flight initiatives. If you're both on there, impacting the service, it's a good chance that you need to talk to them. So it's sort of, comes out of a few places. There's a few places, and to your point, it's kind of, you need those few touch points. You can't rely on one thing for dependency management, because if it's missed, then you're stuffed. Yeah, to your point.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
Cool. No, good. Yeah, no, interested if you've that you've had. I think that is a common thing, really, isn't it? And going to get more so as we get more and more change coming through. Yeah.
Yeah, especially in a data center environment, if you're running this, you'll have more challenges because underlying infrastructure changes are out of your purview. Usually you don't worry too much about that, right? You don't know like what is going on in the infrastructure level. The switch has been upgraded, so that is something you will never check as a dependency. So those things sometimes cause unforeseen hiccups.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And you would make sure in your service that you had a specific risk associated with that, with specific control actions in your checklist, right? Because that is specific to your environment and service. So you would make that every project would need to, every initiative, everybody who's doing a release, because they're not projects these days. Like a lot of services are running their own continual improvement. Again, it's all work package is defined. That's what forms a release. So you don't have to have a formal initiative to trigger a formal project to trigger a work package. You probably still ring fence an initiative and say these people are working on these 5 tickets today. That's under an epic. That's an initiative. But, whatever works, really.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Any other questions? Any other thoughts?